I have 2 days left, and I need to know if my father was a coward.
The fluorescent lights in room 412 of St. Mercy Hospital never fully turned off. They hummed through the night at a frequency just below conscious thought, a sound that had become as familiar to Diane Cole as her own heartbeat over the past 11 months. She had stopped noticing it somewhere around the third week of October, the same week the doctors stopped using words like aggressive treatment and started using words like comfort measures. Now it was the middle of January in Billings, Montana, and the lights hummed and the snow pressed against the window like something trying to get in, and her son was dying. Ethan Cole was 16 years old and weighed 74 pounds. He had been a wide receiver on the junior varsity football team at Rimrock High School 14 months ago. Not the fastest kid on the field, not the biggest, but the one who always found a way to hold on. When the hit came, the one his coach said had hands like a vice grip and a pain tolerance that bordered on the unreasonable. That boy felt like someone from a story now. The boy in the mechanical bed beneath the thin hospital blanket had arms the circumference of a broom handle. His collarbone pressed through the fabric of his gown like a ridge of bare stone. The right leg of his pajama pants was folded flat and pinned at mid-thigh. The amputation site healed clean but brutal in its permanence. The osteosarcoma had taken the leg first. Then it had ignored every chemical they threw at it and climbed into his lungs anyway, the way a fire ignores a wet blanket and finds the dry wood beneath. Dr. Garrett Lund had pulled Diane into the corridor just after 6 in the morning before the day shift arrived, before the ward filled with the particular brand of controlled noise that hospitals use to mask their true nature. He was a tall man with reading glasses he never seemed to actually use for reading, always pushing them up into his gray hair and leaving them there. He had been Ethan's physician for 9 months. Diane had watched him deliver bad news enough times that she could read it in the set of his shoulders before he opened his mouth. His shoulders that morning told her everything. The fluid accumulation in the lung tissue has accelerated significantly overnight, he said. He kept his voice low, one hand resting lightly on the wall beside them, as if the building itself needed steadying. We have adjusted the morphine drip to keep him comfortable, but Diane, we are talking about hours to days now, not weeks. I want you to think about who you need to call. She had nodded. She remembered nodding. She did not remember walking back into room 412 or sitting down in the chair beside his bed or picking up his hand. But at some point she had done all three, because that was where she was when Ethan opened his eyes at 7:30 and looked at her with the particular clarity that the morphine sometimes permitted in the early mornings before the day's doses accumulated and pulled him under. "Mom," he said. His voice had changed over the months. It had gone from the half-broken tenor of a teenage boy to something quieter and more deliberate, as though he had learned to spend words carefully because the air to carry them cost something now. She squeezed his hand. "I am here, baby." He looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the January sky over Billings was the color of old concrete. Snow was falling in thin diagonal lines, the kind of snow that meant business, that had come to stay. "Is Connie coming today?" he asked. Connie Draper was the coordinator from the local chapter of the Children's Wish Foundation, a woman in her late 30s with an enormous turquoise ring on her right hand and the relentless optimism of someone who had learned to weaponize cheerfulness against despair. She had been assigned to Ethan's case 6 weeks ago. She had visited 4 times. Each visit had ended the same way, with Connie pulling Diane into the hallway with her clipboard pressed to her chest and her face arranged into an expression of deep professional regret. "She is stopping by this afternoon," Diane said. Ethan turned from the window and looked at his mother directly the way he did when he wanted her to understand that what he was about to say was not negotiable and had been thought through completely. "It is not going to change," he said. "I know she is going to say no again. But I need you to hear me, Mom. It is the only thing I want." Diane looked at her son's face. She had memorized every part of it over these months. The sharp line of his jaw that had sharpened further as the weight came off the dark circles that had settled beneath his eyes like shadows with nowhere else to go. The small scar above his left eyebrow from a bicycle fall when he was 7. She had spent 11 months being his soldier, his advocate, his wall against everything the disease tried to take from him. She had called insurance companies at midnight. She had driven 4 hours to Missoula for a second opinion that said the same thing as the first. She had read every clinical trial abstract she could find on her phone in the dark of this room while he slept. She had done all of it, and she could not do this one thing. "I hear you," she said. "I will talk to her." He closed his eyes again, not from sleep, but from the particular exhaustion of having spent emotional energy he could not afford to spend. His hand remained in hers, the fingers barely curled. Connie Draper arrived at 2 in the afternoon with her clipboard and her turquoise ring and a paper bag from the sandwich place on Grand Avenue that she always brought as though food were a solution to anything. She was a fundamentally decent woman. Diane had never doubted that. She sat in the visitor chair across from Diane and set the clipboard on her knees and looked at the floor for a moment before she looked up. "Diane," she said, "I went back to my regional director again this morning. I explained the circumstances in full. I want you to know that I genuinely advocated for Ethan and that the answer I received was not one I agree with personally." Diane said nothing. She waited. "Our organization's charter explicitly prohibits us from facilitating or endorsing contact between a wish recipient and any organization designated as an outlaw motorcycle club by the federal government. The Iron Wolves are on that list. My director was not unkind about it, but he was absolute. If we arrange this contact, we lose our nonprofit status and our liability coverage." "I am so sorry. I truly am." From the bed, Ethan spoke without opening his eyes. "What if I write to them myself?" he said. Connie looked at the boy. The professional composure she wore shifted slightly, the way a mask shifts when the face beneath it changes expression. "Ethan, honey, that is not something we can facilitate or endorse in any way," she said carefully. "I did not ask you to facilitate it," he said. "I asked if I could write a letter myself." There was a silence in the room that the fluorescent lights hummed through. "I cannot stop you from doing that," Connie said finally. "But I want to be honest with you about these men. They are not what you might be hoping for." "You do not know what I am hoping for," Ethan said. Connie left 20 minutes later. She squeezed Diane's hand at the door and said she would check in tomorrow and that she was truly sorry and that Ethan was one of the bravest young people she had ever met. Diane believed all of it, and it changed nothing. What Diane did not know as she walked Connie to the elevator and then stood in the corridor for a long moment, pressing her back against the wall and breathing slowly through her nose. What she could not have known was that the letter Connie said she could not stop Ethan from writing had already been written. Had been written 3 days ago in the particular concentrated burst of clarity that sometimes came to Ethan in the pre-dawn hours, when the morphine was thinnest and his mind sharpest, the hours he had learned to use. He had asked Nurse Patrice for a piece of paper and a pen at 4 in the morning, telling her he wanted to write something down before he forgot it. Patrice, who had been a pediatric oncology nurse for 19 years and had learned the particular economy of dying teenagers, had brought him 3 sheets of paper and 2 pens without asking questions. He had written the letter in the 40 minutes between her rounds. He had addressed the envelope using the clubhouse address he had found on his phone the week before. He had asked Patrice when she came back if she could drop it in the outgoing mail on her way out that afternoon. Patrice had looked at the envelope. She had looked at the boy. She had put it in her jacket pocket without a word. The letter had been in the Iron Wolves mailbox on Front Street for 2 days by the time Connie Draper sat in the visitor chair with her clipboard and her apologies. Ethan had not told his mother. He had known she would have tried to stop it. Not from cruelty, but from love, the protective kind that sometimes cannot tell the difference between a shield and a cage. He loved his mother with the fierce, uncomplicated certainty that had only grown clearer as everything else became less certain. But he was 16 years old, and he was dying, and the one question that had followed him through every night of the past 11 months was one she could not answer for him. The question had a shape, it had weight. It had lived in the hinge of the battered metal toolbox that had sat in the corner of the garage on Rimrock Drive since before Ethan could remember the toolbox with his father's initials scratched into the side panel, DC rough letters, the kind a young man makes when he wants to mark something as his own. Danny Cole had died on Highway 87 12 years ago in a rainstorm. Ethan had been 4 years old. He had a handful of memories he could not be certain were real, and not constructed from photographs, his father's forearm, thick with dark hair, resting on a car window. The smell of motor oil and something sweet. In one image he was almost certain was real, because of the physical sensation that accompanied it, the resonance of it in his chest even now, even lying in this bed with his lungs filling slowly with fluid. The image of sitting on the gas tank of an enormous black motorcycle held in place by his father's hands on either side of him, the engine running, not moving, just running, and the vibration traveling up through the tank and into his small body like a second heartbeat. His mother had not talked about his father often, and when she did, her voice took on a careful flatness that Ethan had learned meant the subject had edges she did not want to touch. He had stopped asking by the time he was 9 the way children learn to stop touching a stove. He had understood that whatever his father had been was something that caused his mother pain, and causing his mother pain was something he had never been willing to do. But 11 months in a hospital bed had rearranged his priorities. He had found the coin in November, 2 weeks after the amputation, when he had asked his mother to bring the toolbox from the garage because he wanted something that smelled like the house. She had brought it without asking why. He had opened it in the night, going through the familiar inventory of socket wrenches and electrical tape, and a cracked level, and a tube of marine epoxy, and at the very bottom beneath a folded shop rag, he had found it. It was the size of a $50 heavier than it looked, silver or silver-plated, with a winged skull on one face and on the other a set of initials and a number that meant nothing to him. The skull had a particular style he recognized after a moment of staring at it, a style he had seen on the vest of a man in a gas station parking lot when he was maybe 12. A big man with a gray beard whose presence had rearranged the atmosphere around him the way a thunderstorm does. He had searched the image on his phone, Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, Billings, Montana charter. He had looked at the coin for a long time. Then he had looked up the clubhouse address. The letter he had written was not long. He had not asked them to come. He had not described his illness in detail or tried to make them feel anything. He had written simply that his name was Ethan Cole, that his father had been Danny Cole, that he had found something that he thought belonged to their organization, and that he had one question, and only one question, which was whether his father had been a coward. He wrote that he understood they did not owe him anything, and that he was not looking for comfort or a story. He wrote that he was 16 years old, that he weighed 74 pounds, and that he probably had about 2 days left, so if they were going to respond sooner was better than later. He signed it with his full name. He did not mention the coin. The afternoon Connie Draper left, Rosalind Fitch appeared in the doorway of room 412. She was the hospital's senior patient services administrator, a compact woman in her mid-50s with close-cut silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent a career navigating liability. She had been informed of Ethan's wish through the official channels. Mrs. Cole, Rosalind said, stepping into the room with her hands folded in front of her. "I want to have a direct conversation with you about the situation." Diane looked at her. "I understand Ethan's request, and I want to be clear that I have genuine compassion for what your family is going through." Rosalind's voice was measured and not unkind. "However, I have a responsibility to every patient and staff member in this facility. The Iron Wolves have a documented federal history that I cannot overlook. If you or anyone on Ethan's behalf attempts to contact this organization and they appear on hospital property, I will have no choice but to call law enforcement immediately. I hope you understand this is not a personal decision." Diane looked at the woman for a long moment. "He is 16 years old," Diane said quietly. "He weighs 74 pounds. He does not have a week. The thing he is asking for is not weapons or drugs. It is to hear a motorcycle engine one more time before he dies." Rosalind held her gaze. Her expression did not change. "I am sorry, Mrs. Cole. I truly am. But my answer is the same." She left. The door swung shut behind her. Diane sat back down in the chair beside Ethan's bed. The snow outside the window was heavier now, the sky darkening toward the gray-blue of a Montana winter evening. Ethan was drifting in and out, the morphine having built through the day, into a fog he surfaced from less and less frequently. His breathing had a new sound in it, a faint, wet catch on the inhale that had not been there yesterday. She sat with that sound for a long time. She thought about Danny. She always thought about Danny at her worst moments. Not with longing, but with a complicated anger that had softened over the years without ever fully resolving. He had not been a simple man or an easy husband. He had worked at a machine shop on the south side of Billings, and he had been good with his hands and generous when he had money, which was not often enough. He had loved Ethan with an uncomplicated joy that was the best thing about him. And he had spent time she had always known in circles she did not ask about and did not want to understand, circles that involved men in leather vests and late nights in the particular coded language of people who operate in the spaces between legal and not. She had blamed those circles for his death. She had believed for 12 years that whatever midnight errand he had been running on Highway 87 in a rainstorm had been their doing, their fault, their world claiming what it always claimed eventually. She looked at the toolbox sitting on the shelf under the window. She could see the corner of the shop rag folded at the top. She had not gone through it herself. She had not wanted to. She got up. She crossed to the shelf. She moved the shop rag aside and went through the tools until her fingers found the coin at the bottom, cold and heavy. She held it up in the hospital light. The winged skull looked back at her, unimpressed by its surroundings. She put on her coat. She told Nurse Patrice, who was starting her evening shift, that she would be back within 2 hours and that if Ethan woke up and asked for her to tell him she had gone to take care of something and would be right back. Patrice, who knew what the coin in Diane's pocket meant because she had mailed the letter that referenced it, said she would tell him exactly that. Diane walked out of St. Mercy Hospital into the January night. The Iron Wolves Clubhouse on Front Street was a converted warehouse in the industrial eastern edge of Billings, a part of the city that had once been active and was now mostly a geography of corrugated metal and chain link, and the particular silence of places that have been forgotten by commerce. The building was painted a flat matte black that absorbed the streetlight rather than reflecting it. A corrugated awning over the side lot sheltered a row of motorcycles that, even under their winter covers, had the unmistakable silhouette of machines built for presence rather than efficiency. A 10-foot fence topped with rusted coiled wire surrounded the property. A single security light above the steel door at the front cast a yellow cone over the gravel entrance. Diane sat in her car in the parking lot of a closed auto parts store across the street for 4 minutes. She was shaking not from cold, though it was 19 degrees outside, but from the particular physical expression of terror that the body produces when the mind has made a decision it cannot fully believe it is making. She had driven here, she had parked, she had turned off the engine. The car was already cooling. She thought about Ethan's hand in hers, the weight of it, the way his fingers still instinctively curled around hers even through the morphine. She got out of the car. The crunch of frozen gravel under her boots was very loud in the empty street. She crossed to the gate, which was closed but not padlocked, and pushed it open. The hinges made no sound. The security light caught her as she approached the steel door, and she stood in it, a woman in a gray coat with a coin in her pocket, her breath coming out in visible plumes in the frozen air. The door opened before she knocked. The man who filled the doorway was enormous in the way that specific kind of physical life produces. Not the engineered enormity of a gym, but the accumulated density of decades of labor and weather, and the kind of work that leaves marks. He was perhaps 50, with a neck that had a scar running from behind his left ear to his jawline, and eyes that assessed everything without appearing to move. His cut identified him as Sergeant-at-Arms. His name patch said Slab. "You are in the wrong place, lady," he said. His voice was not raised. He did not need to raise it. Diane reached into her coat pocket and held up the coin. Carl Slab Mercer looked at the coin. Something happened in his face, not a large movement, not an expression exactly, more like the way ice cracks before it shifts a change in structure rather than surface. His eyes moved from the coin to her face. He said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he pushed the gate wider and said, "Come inside." The interior of the Iron Wolves Clubhouse was exactly what she had expected and completely different from what she had imagined. She had expected menace and found instead something more like a working space, a large, open room with a long bar along one wall, a pool table with a torn felt corner, mismatched chairs and tables, the smell of motor oil and stale beer, and something underneath both of those that was simply the smell of a place where men had spent a long time together. A jukebox in the far corner played a classic rock song at low volume. Photographs lined the walls, group shots and event photographs and individual portraits of men on motorcycles. There were perhaps 30 men in the room. The music stopped when Slab brought her in, not because anyone turned it off, but because the room became aware of her presence before she was fully through the door, and the awareness traveled faster than sound. Glasses were set down, heads turned. The particular quality of silence that fills a room when it is deciding something settled over everything. The man at the center of the room, seated at a heavy oak table with his hands flat on the surface, did not stand when she entered. He watched her walk across the floor, and his expression held the stillness of a man who had learned that reaction is a luxury and patience is a tool. Raymond Ironwall Briggs was 58 years old and had the face of someone who had spent those years in direct contact with consequence. The gray beard was full and close trimmed. The eyes were the light blue of old denim, and they were not warm. He was not a large man by the room's standards, but he occupied his chair with an authority that made size irrelevant. His cut bore the president patch, and beneath it on a rocker, the word Billings. Slab set the coin on the table in front of him without explanation. Ironwall looked at the coin. He did not touch it. He looked up at Diane. "Where did you get that?" he said. "My name is Diane Cole," she said. "My husband was Danny Cole. He died 12 years ago on Highway 87. I found that coin in his toolbox." The room did not move. Ironwall picked up the coin and turned it over once in his fingers and set it back down on the table face up. "I know who Danny Cole was," he said. His tone was not cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was factual. "Then you know he had a son," Diane said. "Ethan. He is 16 years old. He is in room 412 at St. Mercy Hospital. He has bone cancer, and he weighs 74 pounds. And Dr. Lund told me this morning that we are talking about hours to days. Ethan's one request, his only request, the only thing he has asked for in 11 months of this is to hear a motorcycle engine one more time and to know whether his father was a good man. That is all. That is everything. I am standing here in front of you because I am his mother, and because when your child is dying, you will do things that you would not otherwise do, and I am asking you, please." Ironwall had not looked away from her while she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, long enough that she could hear the furnace in the building cycling on. Then he said, "Danny Cole stole money from this club. Not a small amount. He cooked books in our garage operation for 14 months, and when we found out, he panicked and he ran. That coin is a debt marker. He owed this club blood." Diane felt the floor beneath her go soft. "I did not know that," she said. "I know you did not," Ironwall said. "That does not change what he did." Diane looked at the man across the table. She thought about saying more. She thought about the arguments she might make, the appeals to decency or mercy or the innocence of a child who bore no responsibility for what his father had been. She had the words. She had always been able to find the words. But something gave way in her, then some final load-bearing structure of composure that had been holding up everything for 11 months, and she felt her knees soften, and before she could stop it, she was on the floor of the Iron Wolves clubhouse, with her hands pressed flat against the concrete, crying in a way she had not let herself cry in front of anyone, not even in front of Ethan. Great wrecking sobs that came from somewhere below language and below dignity, and below any version of herself she had been able to maintain through all of it. She heard Ironwall's voice flat and firm, "Get her up." Slab's hands came under her arms and brought her to her feet with a gentleness that did not match his size or the situation. He walked her to the door and through it and across the frozen gravel to the gate and out onto the street. She did not resist. There was nothing left in her that could resist anything. The gate swung closed behind her. She stood on the sidewalk in the 19-degree night, her breath coming in jagged, visible plumes, her face wet and already going cold. The steel door of the clubhouse was closed. The security light hummed above it. She walked back to her car. The drive back to St. Mercy was 12 minutes. She did not remember most of it. She parked in the visitor structure and took the elevator to the 4th floor and walked down the corridor past the nurse's station, where Patrice looked up and saw her face and said nothing, and pushed open the door to room 412. Ethan was awake. He was watching the door when she came in, as though he had known she was coming, as though some sense that had sharpened as everything else dimmed had tracked her return. His eyes found her face immediately, and she saw him read it, all of it, in the way that sick children learn to read the truth from the faces of the people who love them, because those faces are the only unfiltered information they get. She sat down in the chair beside his bed and took his hand. His thumb moved against her palm, a small, slow movement. "Mom," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Are they coming?" She looked at her son's face, the sharp jaw, the dark circles, the scar above his eyebrow from the bicycle fall when he was 7. Outside the window, the snow was still falling thin and steady and indifferent. She tightened her hand around his. "They are trying, baby," she said. She said it the way you say something you hope the universe overhears. She said it the way a person says a thing when it is the last thing they have, when everything else has been spent. And what is left is the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to let a dying boy spend his final hours without hope. She held his hand and the fluorescent lights hummed and the snow pressed against the window. And outside the hospital, the January night settled over Billings, Montana, cold and absolute, and utterly indifferent to the small, warm room where a mother sat beside her son and waited for something she had no reason to believe was coming. Carl Slab Mercer did not go back inside after he closed the gate behind Diane Cole. He stood in the frozen gravel of the side lot with his hands in the pockets of his cut and looked at the row of covered motorcycles under the corrugated awning and breathed the 19-degree air in through his nose and out through his mouth and did not move for a long time. The security light hummed above the door. Somewhere down Front Street, a semi was running its engine at idle, the low diesel pulse carrying clearly through the cold. He had been sergeant-at-arms for the Iron Wolves Billings Charter for 9 years. Before that, he had been road captain for 6, and before that, just a patched member who showed up and did what was asked. He was 51 years old, and he had developed through sustained exposure to the world a functional immunity to being affected by things he could not change. He went back inside. Ironwall was still at the oak table. The room had returned to its previous state. Conversations resumed, the jukebox restarted, pool cues back in motion. The coins sat in the center of the table in front of the president like a small silver judgment. Ironwall had a glass of bourbon in his right hand that he had not drunk from. Slab sat down across from him. Ironwall did not look up. "There is something I need to tell you," Slab said. Ironwall turned the bourbon glass slowly on the table without lifting it. His eyes came up. Slab reached inside his cut and took out an envelope. It was a standard white envelope, hand-addressed, the writing uneven, and slightly cramped, the letters of a person working against some physical difficulty. The postmark was 3 days old. It was addressed to Iron Wolves MC Billings Charter with the Front Street address. The return address had a name: Ethan Cole Street, Mercy, Hospital Room 412. Ironwall looked at the envelope on the table. "It came in the regular mail 3 days ago," Slab said. "I was sorting the week's delivery. I read it. I did not bring it to you then because I did not know what to do with it, and I thought I had more time to figure that out." Ironwall said nothing. "I was wrong about the time," Slab said. Ironwall set down this bourbon glass. He picked up the envelope and looked at the handwriting for a moment, then opened it and took out the single folded sheet inside. He read it without expression, his face holding the same absolute stillness it held when he played cards, when he negotiated, when he delivered sentences that changed the direction of men's lives. He read it twice. Then he set it flat on the table between them, and Slab read it again alongside him. In the silence, the words the same as the first time he had read them, 3 days ago in this same room, but weighted differently, now changed by what had happened in the past hour, by the image of the woman on her knees on the concrete floor that Slab could not get out of his head. The letter said, "My name is Ethan Cole. My father was Danny Cole. I am not writing to ask you to come or to ask for anything that costs you something. I found an object in my father's toolbox that I think belongs to your organization, and I will return it if you want it. But I have one question and only one question, and I am writing to you because you are the only people who can answer it. Was my father a coward? I do not want a story, and I do not want comfort. I want the truth. I am 16 years old. I weigh 74 pounds. I have maybe 2 days. You do not owe me anything. Ethan Cole." The furnace cycled. The jukebox played something slow and old. Across the room, 2 men laughed at something, and the sound traveled the length of the space and arrived at the oak table already changed into something else. Ironwall folded the letter and held it in his hands without putting it down. "He was a coward," Ironwall said. "Danny Cole was a coward. He stole from his brothers, and he ran, and he died running. That is the truth the boy asked for." Slab looked at the table. He looked at the coin still sitting there, the death's head catching the overhead light. He had a thing to say, and he had been deciding whether to say it for 12 years, and the decision had always been easy before because there had never been a reason compelling enough to make it worth what it would cost. He understood now that the accounting had changed. I need to tell you something else, he said. Ironwall waited. I was the one who went after him that night. The room did not change around them. The music played. The men talked. None of it touched the table where the two of them sat. Ironwall's expression did not change either, but something behind it did the way the temperature of a room changes before the source of heat or cold is visible. You told me Ruiz and Peterman handled it, Ironwall said. His voice was very level. Ruiz and Peterman started after him, Slab said. I caught up to them on Interstate 90 before they hit the Highway 87 split, and I told them I would handle it. They turned around. I kept going. Why? Slab looked at the coin on the table. Because I knew Danny had a kid. Because I had met the kid once at the shop, maybe a year before all of it. He was 3 years old and he came in with his mother to bring Danny lunch. He sat on the seat of the flathead pan Danny was rebuilding and he made engine sounds with his mouth. And Danny looked at him like he was the only thing in the world that made sense. I knew about the money. I knew what Danny had done. But I also knew if we caught him that night, Danny Cole was not going to come home to that kid. Ironwall said nothing. I followed him on 87 in the rain. Slab continued. He knew I was behind him. He was running hard, too hard for the road, too hard for the conditions. I was close enough that my headlight was in his mirror. And then the road went into that long curve above the canyon, and I watched his rear tire break loose on the wet asphalt, and I watched him go through the guardrail. He stopped. I stopped the bike. I went to the rail and looked over. I called 911 from a payphone at the CNX station 4 miles up the road. I drove back to Billings and I told you Ruiz and Peterman ran him off, and I never said another word about it. The silence at the table was its own presence now. You let me believe Ruiz and Peterman handled it, Ironwall said. I let everybody believe that, including Ruiz and Peterman, who were drunk enough by the time they got back that they half believed it themselves. Ironwall stood up from the table. He walked to the bar, set his untouched bourbon on the counter, and stood with his back to the room for a moment. Slab watched him and did not speak. When Ironwall turned around, his face had not rearranged itself into anything new. But there was something in the set of him that was different. Some recalibration happening below the surface that Slab, who had known him for 22 years, could read the way you read a change in river current, not by looking at the surface, but by feeling it against your legs. Ironwall came back to the table. He picked up the boy's letter and read it one more time, just the last 3 lines. I am 16 years old. I weigh 74 pounds. I have maybe 2 days. You do not owe me anything. Then he picked up the coin and held it for a long moment. He was a coward, Ironwall said again. That is still true. Slab said nothing. But he sent a letter before he ran, Ironwall said. Did you know that? Slab looked up. Ironwall opened the bottom drawer of the oak table, the deep drawer that Slab had never seen him open in 9 years, and took out an envelope. It was older than the boy's letter, the paper gone soft at the edges with age, the handwriting on the front more careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone composing something they knew might be the last thing they wrote. The name on the front was Raymond Briggs. No title, no address, just the name, which meant Danny had put it directly into the club's mail, rather than sending it through the post. The envelope had been opened. Ironwall took out the letter inside and unfolded it and set it on the table between them. Slab read it. Danny Cole had written, I know what I did, and I know there is no fixing it, and I am not writing to ask for anything. I took money that was not mine because I was afraid and stupid, and I have been both of those things my whole life. I am writing because I have a son. His name is Ethan. He is 4 years old. He does not know anything about any of this, and he should not ever have to. He is the only thing I have ever done right. If something happens to me, please do not let what I did follow him. He is 4 years old, and he is good, and none of this is on him. That is all I am asking. Danny Cole. Slab read it twice. He looked up at Ironwall. He sent it the same day he ran. Ironwall said, I found it in the stack 2 days after he died. You kept it. I kept it because I did not know what to do with it, and because what he asked for in it was reasonable, and because he was right that the boy had nothing to do with any of it. I honored that much of it. We never went near the mother or the kid. Slab looked at the 2 letters side by side on the oak table. The father's letter 12 years old, the edges soft. The son's letter 3 days old, the handwriting cramped and uneven from morphine, and a body running out of the energy required to hold a pen steady. The same request separated by 12 years and a highway guardrail and every consequence that had accumulated in between. He did not run because he did not care, Slab said. He ran because he was terrified. Those are not the same thing. Ironwall looked at him. The boy already knows his father ran, Slab said. He said so in the letter. He is not asking you to tell him his father was a hero. He is asking if there was anything worth keeping. And you have got a letter in your hand that says the answer is yes. Ironwall stood there for a long time. He was 58 years old and he had been making decisions in rooms like this for 30 years. Decisions that had real weight and real consequence. He understood that some decisions look like choices, but are in fact just the moment when you find out what kind of person you have been all along. He folded Danny's letter carefully along its original creases and put it back in its envelope. He folded Ethan's letter and put it in his inside vest pocket. He picked up the coin from the table and held it in his closed fist. Then he looked at Slab and said, "Make the calls, sir." Slab was already reaching for his phone. The calls went out in a specific order. The order of proximity and reliability, and the depth of the debt that existed between charters and between men. The Seattle charter first because their road captain, Webb Gallagher, picked up on the second ring and said how many and how soon without asking why. Then the Portland charter, then the Missoula Nomads, then the independent riders spread across the eastern Montana corridor who maintained informal ties to the club. Slab did not explain in detail. He said there was a boy at St. Mercy Hospital in Billings who needed to hear a motorcycle engine before morning. He said Ironwall was riding. He said, "Come if you can." He did not ask. With some men, you do not ask. By midnight, the calls had reached riders as far as Spokane and Idaho Falls men who pulled on cold weather gear in dark garages and walked out into temperatures below 20 degrees and kicked engines to life and pointed their front wheels toward Billings. They came because Ironwall had asked and because in that world the weight of a president's word when he chose to spend it was not a small thing. They came because some of them were fathers. They came because some of them had been the kind of young men that the world had written off early, and they understood in a way that did not require explanation what it meant for someone to show up when the official channels had decided you were not worth the effort. They came because there was a 16-year-old boy in a hospital bed who had asked for the truth and did not deserve to die without it. In room 412, Diane had stopped watching the clock somewhere around 10 in the evening. She sat with Ethan's hand in hers and spoke to him quietly when his eyes opened, small things. Memories from when he was small. The time he caught a rainbow trout in the Yellowstone River on a family trip when he was 6 and held it up with both hands with an expression of pure, uncomplicated triumph. The time he made her a birthday card at school that said, "Happy Birthday, Mom," in letters that listed dramatically to the right as though trying to escape the page. He surfaced and sank. The morphine was at its highest dose now, and in the deep parts of the night, it pulled him far under his breathing, slow and shallow, and that wet catch on the inhale present on every breath. Dr. Lund had stopped by at 9. He had checked the monitors and the IV lines and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and said that Ethan was comfortable and that Diane should try to rest. She had thanked him. She had not rested. Nurse Patrice came in at 11 to check Ethan's vitals and stood beside the bed for a moment after she had done what she came to do. She looked at Diane across the sleeping boy. "Did you know about the letter?" Diane said. It was not quite a question. Patrice met her eyes. "I mailed it for him 3 days ago. He asked me not to tell you." Diane looked at her son's face. She was not angry. She did not have the architecture for anger anymore. She felt instead something that was almost like gratitude, the specific gratitude of a mother who has discovered that her child found a way to fight for himself when she could not fight for him. "He never asked me for permission to be brave," Diane said quietly. Patrice said nothing. She put her hand briefly on Diane's shoulder and left the room. At 12 minutes past 1 in the morning, the cup of water on Ethan's bedside table began to vibrate. It was a small cup, institutional plastic half full, sitting on the laminate surface next to the box of tissues and the small framed photograph of a 6-year-old Ethan holding a rainbow trout with both hands. The water moved first a subtle, rhythmic ripple across the surface, too regular for coincidence, too low frequency for the hospital's infrastructure. Diane looked at it without fully understanding what she was seeing. Then she felt it. It came up through the legs of the chair and into the soles of her feet, and then it was in the walls and in the window glass and in the frame of Ethan's mechanical bed, a vibration that was not a single source, but many sources in alignment, a frequency that her body recognized before her mind caught up with what it meant. Ethan's eyes opened. Not the slow, uncertain surfacing of the morphine. They opened with intention, both of them focused and present, as though something below the medication had heard what was coming and pulled him up from the depths to meet it. He turned his head toward the window. "Mom," he said. She was already moving. She crossed to the window in 3 steps and pressed her hands against the cold glass and looked down at the street below the hospital. The main access road to St. Mercy ran from Broadwater Avenue through a long approach lined with bare January trees, and it was down this road that they came. The headlights arriving first like a river of moving stars, dozens and then more than dozens. The sound building from a vibration into a bass frequency, into the full-throated roar of internal combustion engines, multiplied past counting. They came in the organic order of men who have ridden together, who understand instinctively the spacing and the pace. Chrome caught the facility's security lighting and threw it back in fragments as they turned off the road and filled the parking areas, and then went beyond the parking areas, mounting curbs, rolling across the frozen grass of the front lawn, filling the ambulance approach. She could not count them. She could only watch them come. The roar was inside the building now, inside the walls, inside her chest. The monitors in the room trembled. The photograph of Ethan with the trout vibrated against the bedside table. A ceiling tile shifted slightly in its frame. In the corridor outside room 412, the night nursing staff had gathered at the windows. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened, and Rosalind Fitch's voice was audible, elevated, doing what it did when it was very upset and trying to sound like it was not. Diane turned from the window. Ethan was watching her face, reading it the way he had been reading her face for 11 months, the way children read the faces of the people they trust to tell them what is true. She had no managed expression left. What he saw on her face was simply what was there. "They came," she said. Ethan closed his eyes and a sound came out of him that was not words, something older than words, a sound from a place below language, where the body keeps the things it cannot say. Outside, 300 engines idled in the January night, and the sound of them was like weather, like something that had always been part of the atmosphere and had only now arrived at the place it had always been moving toward. In the lobby, 4 floors below, Rosalind Fitch stood in the center of the polished floor with her phone pressed to her ear, her voice at a pitch that the late-night desk staff had not heard from her before. "I need 2 units to St. Mercy Hospital on Broadwater. Immediately," she said. "We have an unauthorized mass gathering of motorcycle club members on hospital grounds. They are on the lawns. They are blocking the emergency vehicle access. I need them removed now." She snapped the phone shut and turned to face the automatic sliding doors. They were already opening. Raymond Ironwall Briggs came through them first, rain damp from the ride, the cold still coming off his cut, invisible waves. Behind him came 10 men, his officers' men shaped by the same decades and the same choices, each of them carrying the particular gravity of people who have spent a long time being the thing that other people are afraid of and have made a certain peace with that. 2 security guards stepped into their path. Ironwall looked at them once. Not a threatening look, not an angry look, a look that simply communicated a complete and accurate assessment of the situation. The guards looked at each other and stepped to the side. Rosalind Fitch moved directly in front of Ironwall, her clipboard raised across her body. "You are trespassing on private medical property," she said. "Law enforcement is en route. If you go 1 step further toward that elevator, I will have every one of you arrested." Ironwall stopped in front of her. He looked at her face with an expression that was neither hostile nor dismissive. He reached into his cut and produced a folded wad of bills and set it on the reception counter to his left, without looking away from her. "For the lawn damage," he said. "And if you want to call the mayor after this is done, I will give you a number that will get him on the line. But I have a boy on the 4th floor who is out of time, and I am going to go up there now." He walked around her. 2 minutes later, the lobby doors opened again, and 2 officers from the Billings Police Department came through, their hands at their belts, their eyes moving across the room with the practiced efficiency of people assessing a situation for threat level. The senior officer, a man named Devereaux, who had been on the force for 19 years, looked at the group of bikers filing toward the stairs. He looked at the row of motorcycles visible through the lobby windows, filling the lawn and the ambulance approach. He stood very still for a moment, in the way of someone running a calculation. Rosalind Fitch crossed to him quickly, her clipboard in both hands now. "Officer, I called this in. These men are trespassing on hospital property and blocking emergency access routes. I need them removed immediately." Devereaux looked at her. He looked at the lobby. He looked through the window at the bikes outside, at the men sitting on them in the 19-degree cold, not moving, not making any gesture that constituted a threat, just sitting there with their engines running in the dark. "Ma'am," he said, "has anyone been assaulted?" "No, but has any emergency vehicle been prevented from accessing the facility?" "Not yet, but are any of these individuals in possession of visible weapons or making verbal threats?" Rosalind opened her mouth and closed it. Devereaux looked at his partner and then back at the administrator. "Ma'am, what I am observing is a group of individuals who have gathered on private property without explicit permission. I am also observing that not one of them has committed a criminal act in my presence. I can ask them to move from the emergency lanes and I will do that. But I will not remove 300 people who have driven through the night in below freezing temperatures to visit a patient in this hospital, because that is not something I have the legal authority to do, and frankly, it is not something I have the inclination to do either." He walked past her toward the outer doors to address the riders nearest the ambulance bay. Rosalind Fitch stood in the center of her lobby with her clipboard and her phone, and the particular expression of a person watching a situation exceed the boundaries of every protocol that has ever governed their professional life. She looked at the phone. She looked at the elevator doors that had closed behind the last of Ironwall's officers. She did not press the button. The stairwell door opened onto the 4th floor with a sound that moved down the corridor. The night nurses pressed back against the walls. Dr. Lund, who had been called back in when the vibration first registered on the building's systems, stood at the nurses' station and watched the men come down the hall. He had been a doctor for 26 years. He had learned that the world sometimes sent the right thing through the wrong door. He stepped forward and met Ironwall's eyes. "Room 412, Dr. Lund said. He is awake." Ironwall nodded once and continued down the corridor, his officers fanning out to line the walls outside the room, creating without instruction or discussion a corridor of leather and scarred knuckles and the accumulated authority of men who had decided something mattered. Ironwall put his hand on the door of room 412. He had driven 90 miles in 19-degree cold with the letter in his inside pocket and the coin in his fist and the weight of 12 years of a decision pressing down on him the way the cold pressed through gear on a long night ride. He had thought about Danny Cole on the highway coming in, not with anger. The anger was spent, but with something that was almost its absence, the hollow place where a long-held feeling goes when it finally leaves. He thought about a 4-year-old boy sitting on a motorcycle gas tank making engine sounds with his mouth. He opened the door. The room was small the way all hospital rooms were small, the mechanical bed taking most of it, the monitors and IV stands crowding the edges, the single window showing a rectangle of black sky and the distant suggestion of the city below. Diane Cole stood near the window with her arms at her sides and her face open in a way that had nothing left of composure in it. Just a woman looking at the door. Her son's last chance had just come through. And on the bed was Ethan Cole. He was looking directly at Ironwall, both eyes open, focused and present, the morphine pushed back by something stronger than chemistry, by the same force that had pulled him up from the depths when the engine started outside. Ironwall walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down. He brought himself level with the boy, elbows on knees, the coin in his hand, and he looked at the 16-year-old, and the 16-year-old looked back at him with eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has learned not to waste time on anything that does not matter. "Did you read my letter?" Ethan said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the steadiness of it was absolute. "I did," Ironwall said. Ethan held his gaze. "Then you know I want the truth, not a story." Ironwall reached into his inside vest pocket and took out both envelopes. The boy's letter, 3 days old. And the older one, the paper gone soft at the edges with age, Danny's handwriting on the front. He set them both on the blanket in front of Ethan. "Start with yours," Ironwall said. "Then read his." Ethan did not reach for the letters immediately. He looked at them lying on the blanket in front of him, the two envelopes side by side, his own letter thin and recent, and the other one older. The paper gone soft at the corners, the way paper goes when it has been kept and left alone for a long time. He looked at them with the particular economy of a person who has learned that attention is a finite resource. Then he picked up his own letter first. He unfolded it slowly. He read what he had written at 4 in the morning 2 weeks ago, his own words coming back to him from a distance, from a version of himself that had been just as sick, but had not yet crossed whatever threshold the past 2 weeks had carried him across. He read it all the way to the end, to the line that said, "You do not owe me anything." He folded it back along its creases and set it down. Then he picked up his father's letter. Diane had not moved from her place near the window. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, holding herself together by physical pressure alone. She had not known about the second letter. She had watched Ironwall take it from his pocket, and she had read the age of it in the softness of the paper, and understood in the way you understand something that reorganizes everything around it simultaneously, that this was something Danny had put into the world before he died, something that had been sitting in a drawer for 12 years, while she built a life on top of the assumption that the man she had married had left nothing behind worth keeping. Ethan read his father his letter. He read it slowly, his eyes moving line by line down the page, and the room was quiet enough that the sound of the engines idling 4 floors below came up through the walls as a continuous presence, a low, steady resonance that had become simply part of the atmosphere of the room, the way the sound of rain becomes part of a room when it has been falling long enough. He read it to the end, to the line that said he is 4 years old and he is good and none of this is on him. He was quiet for a long time after that. Ironwall sat in the chair with his elbows on his knees and did not speak. He understood that silence had its own function and that interrupting it prematurely was a kind of theft. Slab stood near the door. He had not intended to come into the room, but when Ironwall went in, he had followed without deciding, to the way you do a thing that your body understands before your mind catches up with the reasoning. Ethan looked up from the letter. His eyes went to Ironwall first and then moved to Slab, finding him near the door, staying there for a moment, with a quality of attention that was unsettling in its clarity, the attention of someone who sees more than they are given credit for. He was scared, Ethan said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. The effort of speaking was visible in the shallow rise of his chest, but the steadiness did not waver. Ironwall said yes, but he tried to protect me before he ran. Ironwall looked at the boy. He said that letter was in our mail the day after he took the money and before he got on the bike. He wrote it knowing he might not come back. Ethan looked at the letter in his hands. He looked at it for a long time, at the handwriting he had never seen before. The particular shape of the letters his father had formed when he pressed a pen to paper, the evidence of a physical life that had ended when Ethan was 4 years old, and that had left almost nothing behind except a toolbox with initials scratched into the side panel and a coin at the bottom. And now this single page of uneven handwriting that said the boy had been the only thing the man had done right. He was scared and stupid, Ethan said quietly, repeating his father's own words from the letter. He looked up at Ironwall. That is true, Ironwall said. But he knew my name. He knew I was 4 years old. He asked you to look out for me. Ironwall was quiet for a moment. Then he said he did. Ethan folded his father's letter carefully along its original creases, the creases his father had put in it 12 years ago, and that had held their shape through all the years in the drawer. He folded it and held it in both hands and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and something moved across his face that was too complex to name and too private to reduce something that was grief and relief and the particular exhaustion of a question that has been carried for a long time and has finally been set down. He was not a hero, Ethan said. No, Ironwall said, but he was not nothing either. Ironwall said no, he was not nothing. Ethan exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale from somewhere deeper than the lungs, from whatever place in the body holds the things that cannot be said. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, some quality in them had changed, some tension that had been there so long it had become structural, had released. He looked at Ironwall with the directness that had defined every moment of this conversation, the directness of someone who has simplified everything down to what actually matters. I have something for you, he said. He moved his right hand to the blanket beside him and closed his fingers around the coin that Ironwall had set there when he sat down. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, the death's head silver in the hospital light. Ironwall looked at the coin. I found it in his toolbox, Ethan said. I think it belongs to you. Ironwall reached out and took the coin from Ethan's fingers. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a moment. He said, your father earned this. It was his. Ethan shook his head slightly, the smallest movement, minimal and certain. It belongs with you, with the club. He was part of it for whatever time he was, and then he was not, and that is the whole story. But the coin should go back. Ironwall closed his fingers around it. Then Ethan looked at Slab. Slab had not moved from his place near the door. He stood with the expression of a man who has been standing inside a truth for 12 years, without admitting it was a truth, and is now standing inside it with all the lights on and no shadows left to stand in. Ethan looked at him with the same directness he had turned on Ironwall and said, you were there that night. It was not a question. Slab met the boy's eyes. The room was very still. Yes, Slab said. You called for help after. Yes. Ethan held his gaze for a long moment. He was 4 years old in that gaze, and he was 16 years old, and he was every age in between, and he was the person who had written a letter to a motorcycle club from a hospital bed and signed it with his full name. Then you did what you could, Ethan said. Slab's jaw tightened. The muscles along the side of his face moved. He looked at the boy, and the boy looked back at him, and the silence between them had the quality of something being completed, a circuit closing, a current finally finding its path. I should have found you sooner, Slab said. His voice was not entirely steady for the first time. Ethan said you found me when it mattered. Slab looked at the floor. He put one hand against the door frame and pressed it there, and held it there. Then he reached into the pocket of his own cut and took out a motorcycle key. It was old, the chrome worn to a matte finish, the key itself slightly bent from years in a pocket or a drawer. Attached to it by a small ring was a keychain fob in the shape of a small skull, silver-colored the size of a thumbnail, the same iconography as the coin but rendered in 3 dimensions, the eye sockets worn smooth from years of handling. He crossed the room and stood at the edge of the bed and held the key out toward Ethan. This was in the ignition of the bike your father was riding that night, Slab said. After the crash, I took it. I kept it because I did not know how to give it back, and I did not know who to give it back to. He stopped. I kept it 12 years too long. It belongs to you. Ethan looked at the key in Slab's outstretched hand. He looked at the small skull fob, the worn silver, the eye sockets smooth from his father's handling and from all the years of Slab's handling after that. Then he looked up at Slab. Keep it, Ethan said. Slab looked at him. Ride for him one more time, Ethan said. That is what I want. I want you to take it and ride for him. The room was very quiet. The engines outside filled the quiet from below, a continuous low presence that had become by now simply the sound of the night, as natural as wind. Slab took the key back. His fingers closed around it carefully, the way you take something that has been given to you freely and that you understand the full weight of and do not intend to treat lightly. He closed his fist around it. He said, I will ride for him every mile until there are no more miles left. Ethan looked at him for a moment with the full attention he had left. Then he nodded. It was a small movement. Final in the way that small movements sometimes are, the way a door closing quietly carries more weight than one slamming. The way the last word of a sentence carries the meaning of all the ones before it. Ironwall stood up from the chair. He reached up and began unbuttoning his cut, the heavy leather vest with its president patch and its years of road and weather and consequence sewn into every inch of it. He slid it off his shoulders and held it for a moment, the weight of it settling in his hands. And then he leaned forward and laid it across Ethan's chest. The leather covered the boy from his chin to his knees. The patches and the embroidery and the worn spots and the small tears that had been there so long, they had become part of the garment's character, all pressing against the thin hospital blanket and Ethan's thinner chest beneath it. Ethan put both hands on the leather. He spread his fingers against it and pressed them down slowly, feeling the weight of it, the texture of it, the smell of it, which was gasoline and road dust and cold air, and decades of a life lived in a particular way that had its own logic and its own costs and its own rare and specific honors. Your father's debt is settled, Ironwall said. His voice had the register of a man delivering something he has been carrying a long time and is finally able to put down. Whatever he owed this club died with him on that highway, and it is not yours, and it never was. You carry nothing from him but the good parts. You hear me?" Ethan looked up at him from beneath the weight of the leather vest. "I hear you," he said. Ironwall put his hand flat on the vest over the boy's chest over the president patch and held it there for a moment. His hand was large and calloused and mapped with old scars, and Ethan's chest beneath it was small and fragile, and the contrast between them was the whole story told in a single image. "You are patched," and Ironwall said. "You ride with us, little brother." Something moved across Ethan's face. Not happiness exactly, not in the way that word usually operates, but something that was happiness, stripped of everything except its essential nature. The thing underneath the performance of it, the thing that is just presence and rightness, in the absence of the particular fear that has been present for so long, it had become the background frequency of everything. He looked at Diane. She had not moved from her place near the window. She was looking at her son, and the tears on her face were not the tears of the past 11 months, not the tears of fear and exhaustion. They were something else. She did not have a name for them and did not need one. Ethan turned his head toward the window. Outside, the January sky over Billings was still dark, that particular pre-dawn darkness that is the deepest part of the night. Below the window, the engines of 300 motorcycles continued their low, steady conversation with the frozen air. Ethan put both hands back on the leather vest spread across his chest and pressed them flat against it and felt the weight of it. Ironwall reached for the radio on his belt. He brought it to his mouth. "Let him hear it," he said. The sound that came up through the floor and the walls and the window glass in the next moment was not like the idling that had been there since the men arrived. It was different in kind, not just in degree. 300 throttles opened simultaneously, and the sound went from a presence to a force, from something felt in the feet, in the chest, to something that was simply everywhere at once, that occupied the building the way water occupies a vessel, filling every space, every corner, every frequency. The monitors trembled on their stands. The photograph of Ethan with the trout walked a quarter-inch across the bedside table. The window in its frame vibrated at a frequency just below the threshold of visible motion. It was not a sound you heard. It was a sound you became part of. Diane pressed both hands to her mouth. Ethan closed his eyes. The expression on his face in the moment his eyes closed was not peace in the way the word is usually used, not the peace of absence or resignation. It was the peace of completion, the peace of a question answered and a weight set down and a hand finally unclenched after holding something for a very long time. It was the face of a 16-year-old boy who had gotten the one thing he had asked for and who was ready. The engines held. They held through the first minute and the second and into the third, a sustained roar that shook the bones of the building and traveled outward through the frozen Billings night for miles in every direction, waking people in their beds, causing dogs to lift their heads, reaching out across the dark city like something that had a destination and knew where it was going. The monitor beside the bed changed its sound at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. It did not alarm, it simply changed. The rhythmic pattern that had marked Ethan's heartbeat through 11 months of this room became a single sustained tone, flat and continuous, the sound of a line that has reached its end. The engines outside held for another full minute after that. 300 men sitting on idling machines in the January cold, none of them moving, all of them holding the throttle open, all of them giving this to a boy they had never met because Ironwall had asked them to, and because even the roughest of them understood, without having to be told, that what they were part of in this moment was something that did not come along often and that would stay with them. Then one by one, beginning from the back of the formation and moving forward like a tide going out, the engines quieted. The last one ran for a moment alone in the silence, a single Harley somewhere at the edge of the hospital lawn, and then it too went quiet. The room at that moment was the quietest it had been in 11 months. Diane had moved to the bed when the monitor tone changed, and she was there now, bent over her son, with her face against his hair, her hand covering both of his, and the sounds she made belonged only to that room, in that moment, and were not for anyone else to name. Ironwall stood at the foot of the bed, with his hands at his sides. He looked at the boy beneath his vest, and he did not look away. He had not looked away from things his whole life, and he did not look away from this. Slab stood near the window with the motorcycle key closed in his fist and his jaw set in the way of a man holding himself together by the application of will alone. Dr. Garrett Lund came in quietly a few minutes later. The way doctors come in when there is no longer any medical urgency, when what is required is not expertise, but presence. He checked what needed to be checked with the gentleness of someone who has done this enough times to understand that his role now was simply to be a human being in the room. He placed his hand briefly on Diane's shoulder. Then he stepped back and stood near the door and let the room be what it needed to be. Ironwall moved at last. He walked to the side of the bed and stood over Ethan, looking at the boy's face. The morphine and the illness had taken so much from him over 11 months, and what was left was what had always been there underneath all of it, the structure of the face, the particular set of the jaw that Diane had memorized, and that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life as the most precise definition she knew of the word brave. Ironwall put 2 fingers on the collar of his own vest, where it lay across the boy's chest. He wrote out, "Brave," Ironwall said. His voice was quiet, and it did not waver, and those 4 words were exactly what they needed to be, and nothing more. Outside the hospital, the last of the 300 men were mounting their bikes and moving slowly back onto Broadwater Avenue, chrome and leather, dispersing into the darkness of the Montana night. Some of them would ride an hour before they stopped. Some of them would ride until dawn. A few of them would not entirely understand what they were feeling on the road home. The particular weight of having been present for something, of having given something that cost nothing and meant everything. In the corridor outside room 412, the night nursing staff stood in ones and twos with the particular quietness of people who have witnessed something that does not fit into the normal taxonomy of their work. The young nurse on his first year in the oncology ward said thank you in a voice barely above a whisper as Ironwall passed, and Ironwall paused and looked at him and nodded once and continued to the stairs. Slab was the last of them to leave the floor. He stopped in the doorway of room 412 and looked back at the room, at Diane still bent over her son, at the leather vest still spread across the bed, at the small frame photograph on the bedside table of the 6-year-old boy with both hands around a rainbow trout and an expression of pure, uncomplicated triumph on his face. He looked at that photograph for a long moment. Then he closed the door softly behind him and walked down the corridor and down the stairs and out into the January cold where his bike was waiting. The dawn came slowly over Billings, the way January dawns come in Montana without drama or announcement, the darkness simply becoming less dark by degrees, until the line of the rim rocks to the north emerged from the gray, and the city began its first sounds of the day. Diane was still in room 412 when the light began to change in the window. She had sat through the rest of the night in the chair beside her son with his hand in hers, and she had talked to him quietly in the dark, because she had been talking to him for 16 years and she was not ready to stop yet. She told him about the rainbow trout. She told him about the birthday card with the letters listing to the right as though trying to escape the page. She told him about the February morning 17 years ago when she had held him for the first time and he had looked up at her with an expression of complete and uncompromising attention, as though she were the most important thing he had ever seen, as though he had arrived with his mind already made up about her. She told him she was proud of him. She told him that what he had done, the letter, the asking, the knowing, what he needed, and going after it without apology, was the most completely himself thing he had ever done. She told him his father had not been nothing. She told him that she was sorry she had not said so sooner, that her silence about Danny had been her fear and not his to carry, and that he had deserved better than that silence for a long time. At some point, she became aware that there was an envelope on the chair to her left that had not been there before. Old paper soft at the edges, her name written on the front in handwriting she recognized now, having seen it an hour ago on a letter her son had held in his hands. Ironwall had left it on the chair when he passed her on his way out. She held the envelope for a long time without opening it. She did not need to read what was inside to know what it contained. She had watched her son read it. She had seen what it did to his face, the thing it released in him that had been held for so long. She knew the last line by heart already, not because she had read it, but because the effect of it was written in her son's face in the moment before he folded the letter and held it in both hands and exhaled. He is 4 years old and he is good, and none of this is on him. She set the envelope in her lap and looked at the window where the Billings sky was going from gray to the pale, thin blue of a January morning. She thought about Danny not with the old anger and not with grief exactly, but with something that had no name, yet something that might become a name over time. A man who had been afraid and stupid and who had known it. A man who in the last hours before everything went wrong had thought first of a 4-year-old boy and had done the only thing he had left to do for him. It was not enough. It had never been enough. But it was not nothing. Outside the window, the hospital grounds were marked with the evidence of the night tire tracks in the frozen grass curving in long arcs across the lawn, the pattern of 300 arrivals and 300 departures pressed into the earth and already beginning to stiffen in the cold. A facilities worker in an orange vest stood at the edge of the lawn with a coffee cup in his hand, looking at the tracks with an expression of professional bewilderment that would take him most of the morning to resolve into language. On the highway west of Billings, a man named Carl Slab Mercer rode into the morning cold with a motorcycle key closed in his right fist in the open road ahead of him, in the particular quality of silence that comes from the inside of a helmet when the engine noise takes everything else away. He rode with his fist closed around the key the whole way, the small skull fob pressing its shape into his palm, and he did not open his hand until he stopped an hour later at a pull-off above the Yellowstone River, where the water moved dark and quick between its frozen banks. He sat on the bike for a while. He looked at the river. Then he opened his hand and looked at the key and the worn skull and the smooth eye sockets. And he said something that the wind took before it reached anyone, something between himself and the morning and the river, and the man the key had belonged to, and the bird who had given it back to him with instructions. He closed his hand around it again. He kicked the bike back to life. He rode.